What if the woman your company humiliated was the one signing all your paychecks? She didn't scream. She didn't protest. She simply watched. And when the truth was revealed, the laughter stopped and the fear began. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. And by the end, you'll question how many good people you've pushed aside without ever knowing who they truly were. The sliding doors parted with a soft hiss as she stepped inside, her cane tapping lightly against the polished marble, the echo of it drowned beneath the thrum of luxury. Heels clicking, phones ringing, espresso machines hissing behind sleek glass counters. Margaret Langston paused at the center of the grand lobby, her silver hair neatly pinned, her coat dated but clean, her shoes worn but dignified. She looked around slowly, as if searching for something more human than the chrome and coldness around her. Behind the reception desk, a young woman barely lifted her gaze, her perfectly lined lips twitching in irritation. "Ma'am, if you're lost, there's a public bench outside," she said without warmth. Margaret offered a gentle smile. "I'm here for a meeting," with who the receptionist asked, not bothering to hide the disbelief in her tone. "It's not on the schedule." "It's private," Margaret replied softly. "I was told to come through the front." The receptionist scoffed and tapped rapidly on her keyboard. "There are no walk-in appointments allowed, especially not today." A suited intern leaned against the wall nearby, watching her with mild amusement, whispering something to his colleague, who chuckled. "Maybe she thinks this is a hotel," one said under his breath. Margaret turned her head slightly, catching their reflection in the glass. How quickly people forget themselves when they think you're beneath them. She moved toward the waiting area, her steps deliberate. But a junior staff member quickly intercepted her. "Ma'am, you really can't sit here without clearance. These seats are for clients only." "I'm not in a hurry," she replied, settling into the corner chair anyway. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded them over her cane. The employees exchanged glances. The whispers grew. One woman muttered, "This is getting awkward." And yet, Margaret sat still, like a stone in the center of a storm. She had walked into this building decades ago with nothing but a dream and a partner. Today, she had walked in with a test, and no one had passed. Not yet. The receptionist rolled her eyes dramatically as she turned to her coworker, whispering loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Maybe she's here for a charity handout." The other woman laughed behind a manicured hand, glancing toward the old woman seated quietly in the corner, like she was an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. A pair of interns emerged from the elevator, carrying designer tote bags and overpriced coffee, stopping mid-step when they noticed her. "Is she lost one?" asked with a smirk. "Looks like someone's grandma wandered in." "Probably waiting for her grandson to finish sweeping the floor," the other added, raising her phone to snap a discreet photo. The sound of the camera shutter, though subtle, cut through the air like a slap. Margaret didn't react. She simply sat back straight, her eyes soft, and observed everything without a trace of shame. But the room seemed to hum louder with cruelty. Another employee passed by, glanced at her, and scoffed. "She's making the place look like a soup kitchen." A security guard approached slowly, sizing her up. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right building?" She nodded gently. "Yes, dear." He hesitated, unsure, then walked off with a confused shake of his head. The interns were still watching, one now typing furiously on their phone. Posting this, caption, "Corporate lobby meets thrift store, Queen." Laughter erupted quietly behind her. Margaret sat still, her hands folded neatly over her purse. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. But she had never felt so invisible in a place she had built. A young assistant, standing behind the front desk, glanced at the scene with discomfort, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She didn't laugh. She didn't join in. Something about the woman's calmness didn't match the insults being thrown at her. Something felt wrong. But no one else noticed. No one else cared. Because when you wear wrinkles and threadbare clothes, people stop asking questions, and start assuming answers. "All right, that's enough," the supervisor barked, stepping out from behind the frosted glass door with a clipboard tucked under one arm and frustration etched into her flawless face. She didn't bother asking who Margaret was. She didn't bother listening. She simply pointed toward the exit like she was swatting away clutter. "Ma'am, this is a high-security building. and we can't have unauthorized visitors loitering. If you don't have an appointment, you'll need to leave immediately." Margaret looked up, her expression still gentle, almost amused, as if she'd seen this play before, many times. "I'm just waiting to be received," she said softly. "Not anymore." "You're not?" the woman snapped, turning towards security. "Escort her out." Kindly, but firmly. The young guard hesitated. "She's not doing anything wrong." "Do it!" the supervisor hissed under her breath, shooting a glare that silenced the entire room. The guard nodded reluctantly, stepping toward Margaret. "Sorry, ma'am, but I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The interns across the room smirked, one lifting a phone again. "Oh, this is too good," he whispered. "CEO's grandma gets the boot. Viral moment incoming." A quiet beep marked the beginning of the recording. The receptionist crossed her arms, watching with satisfaction as the old woman rose slowly, using her cane to steady herself. "Let's go," the guard said gently, but even his voice trembled with embarrassment. Margaret stood tall. Despite the stiffness in her knees, despite the sting of humiliation now spreading through the lobby like a storm cloud, dozens of eyes watched as she was walked past reception, past the glass elevators, past the laughing interns. "This isn't a retirement home. Sweetheart," one woman called out behind her. The others laughed. The camera kept rolling, and just before she reached the front door, Margaret paused. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping over the sea of smirking faces, frozen hearts, and fake smiles. She said nothing. She didn't have to, because her silence spoke volumes, because in that moment, the people who believed they held power had just sealed their place in a lesson they would never forget. As the glass doors slowly shut behind Margaret, a quiet unease fell over the lobby. Not guilt, not yet, but the hollow kind of silence that lingers after something is broken and no one's willing to admit they heard it shatter. The receptionist returned to her desk with a satisfied click of her heels. The interns gathered around a phone, replaying the video, laughter bubbling between them like poison and crystal. "Wait till this hits TikTok," one of them whispered. "She'll be famous by lunch." But behind the front desk, a young woman named Elena sat frozen, her hand trembling slightly above the keyboard. She couldn't stop thinking about the way the old woman had looked at them. Serene, unbothered, like she knew something no one else did. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Elena opened the day's guest log and scrolled quickly past the scheduled executive meetings. Her eyes stopped cold when she saw the name written in bold, Langston, Margaret, private visit, do not announce, chairman protocol. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered, a chill climbing up her spine. She checked the time. Margaret had arrived exactly on schedule. Elena stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her stool. "I need to stop them," she murmured, heart pounding as she rushed toward the doors. "Stop," who the supervisor barked from across the room. Elena didn't answer. She pushed through the rotating door, scanning the street, but the woman was already gone. Her small frame swallowed by the city's rush, by the indifference of traffic and strangers. Elena ran back inside, her voice panicked now. "We need to contact Mr. Hayward. Right now, she's not just anyone." The receptionist laughed, still scrolling through comments. "What, is she royalty now?" But Elena's voice cracked through the smugness. "She's the chairwoman of the entire company." The room stopped, like a record scratch in a concert hall, and in that sudden silence, the only sound was the low hum of a phone vibrating on the counter. Notification after notification pouring in from the video that would soon make all of them unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. The tension in the lobby had calcified into something brittle and dangerous, like glass under pressure, and just as the weight of what had happened began to sink in, the building's massive front doors parted again with a hush that felt more like judgment than welcome, and in stepped Mr. Hayward, the company's director, his sharp suit unwrinkled, his pace clipped and controlled, his eyes scanning the space like a surgeon walking into an open wound. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't nod at anyone. His phone was pressed to his ear, and his voice, though quiet, sent a chill through the room. "I just got word she was here. What do you mean no one escorted her? Who authorized this mess? His eyes landed on Elena, the only one standing, the only one looking like she wanted to throw herself between him and the wreckage that had unfolded. Where is she? He asked, low and dangerous. Elena opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the front doors opened again, and everything stopped. Margaret Langston stepped back into the lobby. No anger in her expression, no vengeance in her stride, just calm, regal stillness, like a queen who never needed a crown to command silence. Mr. Hayward turned without a word, strode directly to her, and before anyone could process what was happening, he bowed, deep, respectful, full of something none of them had shown her reverence. "Madam Chairwoman," he said, his voice cutting clean through the stunned lobby. "We've failed you." The interns froze mid-scroll. The receptionist's mouth hung open. The supervisor stepped backward as if trying to undo the last 20 minutes with distance. Margaret offered a gentle smile. "No, Mr. Hayward, you haven't failed me. You've revealed yourselves." And just like that, the balance of the room shifted. The woman they had mocked for her clothes, her wrinkles, her stillness was now the axis around which the entire company turned, and every person in that lobby realized they hadn't just mistreated an old woman. They had spat on the hands that built the very floors they stood on. The weight of her words sank into the room like concrete into glass, and not a single person dared to breathe too loudly as Margaret Langston turned her gaze slowly, deliberately, from one face to the next. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with a depth so calm it was terrifying, because her silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, like the final page of a book everyone forgot they were a part of. Mr. Hayward remained bowed slightly beside her, not out of fear, but out of shame. And when he finally rose, his face was taut, jaw clenched, voice trembling with restrained fury as he asked, "Who treated the chairwoman this way?" No one answered. The receptionist looked down at her screen as if numbers could save her. The interns slowly slid their phones into their pockets, color draining from their faces. The supervisor cleared her throat, stepped forward, and whispered, "She didn't say who she was." Margaret tilted her head. "And that's when your decency stops." The woman froze, words caught in her throat, because there was no defense for cruelty born of assumptions. Mr. Hayward's voice cut like a knife through velvet. Everyone who laughed, everyone who watched and did nothing, everyone who chose pride over compassion, step forward now, or don't bother stepping back in tomorrow. The room stood frozen. Not a foot moved, but the shame did. It crawled up necks, flushed cheeks, weighed down shoulders. Only one figure moved: Elena, hands clasped in front of her, eyes wet but unflinching. She stepped forward, not to defend herself, but to stand in something that mattered. Margaret turned to her with the softest smile. "What's your name?" "Dear Elena." "Ma'am, you tried to stop them," Margaret said gently. "You saw what others refused to see." Elena nodded once, barely able to speak. Margaret reached out and touched her arm. "Don't ever lose that, even when the world makes you feel small for it." And as Margaret began walking deeper into the building, the hall she had once helped design, now trembling beneath the truth of her presence, the rest of them remained frozen. Because the moment they realized who she was wasn't nearly as haunting as the moment they realized who they had become. Margaret's footsteps echoed down the corridor like a quiet metronome of reckoning, each tap of her cane not just a sound but a statement. And as she walked with Elena at her side and Mr. Hayward trailing behind, the lobby behind them unraveled into a graveyard of pride, where no apology could be loud enough to drown out what had already been witnessed. Phones were silenced, glances were avoided, and the very walls seemed to tighten with judgment. Upstairs, HR had already been alerted, and by the time Margaret reached the executive floor, 3 names had been submitted for immediate termination. The intern who filmed, the receptionist who mocked, the supervisor who ordered her out. Mr. Hayward didn't blink. This building was built on values, and we forgot them. He said to the gathered staff, "Consider this a course correction." The young man who filmed her tried to plead. "I didn't know." But Margaret stopped him with a glance. "That's the point," she said. You only cared who I was after you found out what I owned." He lowered his head, and for the first time, silence wasn't defiance. Oops, it was defeat. Security escorted the three out, not with violence, but with the cold quiet of justice unfolding not in secret, but in the full view of everyone who had laughed and done nothing. Meanwhile, Margaret turned to Elena once more, her voice calm. "I came today without a title to see who you all are when no one is watching," she said, "and you passed." Elena's eyes filled, not because she'd won something, but because she had done the right thing when it cost her nothing. And now, somehow, it meant everything. Mr. Hayward stepped forward. "I'd like to recommend Elena for a promotion," he said firmly, effective immediately. Margaret didn't hesitate. "Make it happen." And as Elena followed the chairwoman into the boardroom, her head held higher than ever before. The rest of the company was left behind to reckon with a truth far more lasting than any policy that dignity is a mirror, and everyone had just seen their reflection. Inside the boardroom, the heavy door closed behind them with a hushed finality, sealing off the noise of the shaken office outside, and for a long moment, Margaret Langston said nothing as she stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her hands resting gently on the back of a leather chair, her eyes not filled with anger, but something far heavier. Grief, perhaps, or disappointment too old to rage. Elena stood beside her, unsure whether to sit or speak, her heart pounding with the weight of the moment. Margaret finally broke the silence. "This company," she said softly, "wasn't built for the polished or the privileged. It was built by calloused hands and sleepless nights. My husband and I didn't wear labels. We wore hope." She walked slowly toward the massive window overlooking the city, her reflection mixing with the skyline. "I came today unannounced to see if this place still remembered that, to see if anyone still saw people." She turned back, her gaze locking with Elena's. "And you did. When everyone else looked away, you paused. That pause is where humanity lives." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know you were the chairwoman." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and gratitude. That's why it mattered. She gestured toward the table, inviting Elena to sit. "Not as an assistant, but as someone being seen. You reminded me of myself, not the woman on the magazine covers, the one in the basement, typing proposals no one read, answering phones with a voice no one remembered. I built this from that place. And I never want the doors of this company to close to someone simply because they don't shine on the outside." Mr. Hayward entered quietly, placing a thick folder on the table. "We've started drafting a new internal policy, the Langston Standard. It prioritizes humility, presence, and respect at every level. Every employee will be trained. Every leader is held accountable." Margaret nodded. "And let it start with her," she said, glancing at Elena, "not just with a promotion, but with a voice." Elena swallowed hard, emotion rising in her throat. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You are," Margaret replied without hesitation, "because when no one else passed the test, you didn't even know there was one, and you chose kindness anyway." And in that room, high above a city that often rewarded Polish over principle, a legacy wasn't just remembered, it was restored. In the quiet strength of two women who understood that real power never needs to announce itself. It simply stands up when no one else will. By Monday morning, everything felt different. Not louder, not harsher, but quieter in a way that demanded more from people. Like the building itself had absorbed the shame and now held a mirror to every person who walked through its glass doors. On every floor, a new plaque had been installed beside the elevators, etched in brushed steel with 5 simple words: "Respect is our highest currency." The Langston Standard had gone into effect overnight, not as a memo buried in inboxes, but as a lived, visible transformation. Managers held briefings where kindness was not a suggestion, but a requirement. Interns received training not just in protocol, but in empathy. And the old video, the one meant to shame, was reposted by the company with Margaret's approval. This time, with a different caption, "Watch carefully." Then ask yourself, who are you when no one is watching? It went viral again. But this time, the world didn't laugh. It leaned in, reflected, and reposted. Comment sections flooded with tears, apologies, confessions, and gratitude. Across the country, other companies began sharing the story, some changing their own policies, others simply acknowledging the deep, uncomfortable truth that cruelty often wears a name tag too. And in the middle of it all was Elena, now sitting at her new desk with her nameplate freshly engraved, not because she had shouted her way upward, but because she had quietly done the right thing when it would have been easier to stay small. Margaret visited her once that week, unannounced as always, standing at her door with a warmth that no title could dim. "How's it feel?" she asked. Elena smiled, eyes bright with purpose, like I finally stepped into something bigger than myself. "You did," Margaret said gently, "and now you hold the door for others." Outside, a new employee passed the front desk and paused to compliment the receptionist. Not because he had to, but because now people saw each other. And as the company began to hum with something deeper than ambition, something like dignity, it became clear that one woman's silent test had become a movement. Not loud, not forced, just real, and real lasts. The sun spilled gently through the tall windows of the lobby as Margaret Langston stepped inside once more, her cane tapping softly, her coat neatly buttoned, her presence no longer questioned but quietly revered, though she never asked for bows, never demanded attention. She simply moved through the building like the quiet force it had forgotten it was built upon. No security blocked her path. No receptionist dismissed her. In fact, the new receptionist stood as she entered, not out of fear, but out of respect earned the hard way. And with a warm smile, she said, "Welcome back, Chairwoman Langston." Margaret nodded gently and continued walking, not to inspect, not to intimidate, but to remember. She walked past workstations where employees now looked each other in the eye, where laughter wasn't laced with cruelty, where kindness was no longer viewed as weakness, but as leadership. She paused outside the glass-walled boardroom where Elena sat in a meeting, confidently sharing ideas, her voice clear, her seat earned not by status, but by choice. Margaret watched for a moment and smiled. Not because she had built a company, but because she had reignited its soul. As she made her way to the exit, a young janitor, no older than 20, held the door for her. "Have a wonderful day, ma'am," he said with sincerity. She paused. "And you too, young man. Don't let this world rush you. Walk with purpose." He smiled, unsure why her words hit so deep. Margaret stepped into the light outside, the city buzzing around her, the building behind her finally reflecting what she had always hoped it would become, not a monument to wealth, but a sanctuary of worth. And as she walked down the street, disappearing into the rhythm of the crowd, no one saw a billionaire or a chairwoman. They saw a woman who had once been invisible, now walking tall because she never stopped seeing others. She was old, she was quiet, she was everything they thought didn't matter, until they realized she built the world they stood on. And in the moment they bowed, it wasn't to money, it was to regret. Remember this, the person you shame today may be the shadow watching your rise, and the hand that decides your fall. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with silence and a lesson burned into memory.